Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of Real History. I am your host, History Professor Jared Frederick, and for this episode, I am joined by my good friend and former boss, really great boss, at Gettysburg National Military Park, Scott Hartwig. Scott, thanks so much for joining us on this episode.
It's good to be here with you, Jared.
All right. We have a very special thematic episode lined up for you this time because it just so happens that Scott is the author of 2 books on the Antietam campaign, one of which is brand new. Both of them are published through Johns Hopkins University Press, and the latest one is entitled, I Dread the Thought of the Place. And as you can see, they are modest tomes, very concise histories of the Maryland campaign. No, they're very, very detailed. And I suspect really the ultimate books on the Maryland campaign culminating in the Battle of Antietam. So, Scott, if you would, tell us a little bit about your books.
Yeah, To Antietam Creek, this took me about 20 years to write. It became kind of a joke in the Park Service that Hartwig was writing this book. But I had a job, raising kids, all sorts of stuff like that.
Life happens.
It took a long, long time. This is about the Maryland campaign up to the night before the Battle of Antietam. So it includes the siege and capture of Harper's Ferry, which is almost never covered when people write about the Maryland campaign. This is one of the reasons why I did this in 2 volumes, is I really wanted to give Harper's Ferry its due attention, and also the battles of South Mountain at Turner's Gap, Fox's Gap, and Crampton's Gap. So it covers all of those. It covers the preliminary part of before the Battle of Antietam, and it ends the night before the battle begins. And then this volume, I Dread the Thought of the Place, it has a foreword that catches you up on the military, political, social situation in the country. So if you didn't read To Antietam Creek, you can kind of get the gist of what that is in the foreword. And this is about the Battle of Antietam and the aftermath of the Battle of Antietam. So it goes from the opening of the battle all the way till in November when George McClellan was relieved of command of the Army of the Potomac. Because I start To Antietam Creek with George McClellan, and I felt it was important to end the second volume with George McClellan. He's such a central figure to this entire campaign, and you can't kind of, I just felt the story needed to be told to wrap the whole thing up. So, yeah, that's the story on the 2. I Dread the Thought of the Place. The title comes from a quote from one of my favorite soldiers in the Civil War, Rufus Dawes. He was at Antietam, a major in the 6th Wisconsin Volunteers, and he was writing about Antietam about 9 months after the battle. And he'd read in the newspaper that the newspaper was predicting that there might be another battle at Antietam. And he wrote, I hope not. The flower of our regiment was slaughtered in the terrible cornfield. He says, I never want to fight there again. I dread the thought of the place. And I thought that was a very appropriate title for how many men who fought at Antietam remembered it.
Indeed. You can find the links to purchase both of these books in the caption below. And if you are a Civil War buff, these are 2 books that you absolutely must have on your library shelf. But first, what we are going to take a look at is Scott is going to be joining us for a special segment where we hand-picked 4 carefully curated film selections that look at how the Battle of Antietam has been portrayed in cinema. And so we are going to be moving chronologically, and our very first one is a television miniseries that many of you are undoubtedly familiar with. Number 1. The 1986 miniseries North and South. This is part of a 3-installment miniseries that came out in the 1980s and the 1990s based on John Jake's best-selling novels, and Book 2 looks at the war years themselves. A portion of that series looks at the Battle of Antietam. Let's take a look at it right now. All right, so of course, this part of the series, all of the series, it was made for television. It perhaps doesn't have the cinematic quality that Glory does. But I think one of the things that stands out to people in this scene is the fact that you have 2 friends that encounter each other on the battlefield. Now, the Hazards and the Maines depicted in the series, of course, are fictional. They are not real-life people. But do you know of any instances around the time of the Battle of Antietam where perhaps friends or family members found themselves on opposite sides?
There's one instance that I know of, I'm sure it happened in a number of different places. It's just the nature of it. But on September 18th, the day after the battle, there was a temporary truce called between the lines near the Dunkard Church. And there were units of the Union 6th Army Corps that were there. It was the New Jersey Brigade under Alfred Torbett. And there was a detachment of New Jersey soldiers that were out there. It was very, one of the things about these truces is that they would establish these picket lines, and you could not cross the picket line at all to get anybody. So it turned out this Confederate unit came up, and one of the men who was in the Confederate unit, they were burying the Confederate dead, and there was a Confederate officer from South Carolina that they wanted to get. And so they ended up, the Confederates have to communicate with this lieutenant who's commanding this part of the picket line, and the Confederate who was coming up to negotiate with him had been his roommate in college.
Wow. At
a college in New Jersey. A lot of Southerners went to northern colleges because they just had a better education system in the North. And anyways, to make a long story short, the lieutenant was, because they knew each other and they were friends, he let them come through the picket line to get the Confederate soldier that they wanted to get.
Sometimes truth is stranger than fiction.
Yeah.
Hollywood doesn't often reflect on the truth, though, in some instances. And speaking of truth, we have sort of like a quasi-weird, sort of funky interpretation of the Battle of the Sunken Lane. The part of the battle scene ends with the camera panning across all of the dead bodies, which is certainly reminiscent of some of the photographs taken right afterward. But we even see the Irish Brigade flag at one point in the fighting too. So there are these traces of truth in the scene.
Right.
How does it stand up to you?
It looks like a high quality reenactment, really.
Number 2. 1989's Glory, directed by Edward Zwick. This is, of course, the iconic film about the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, one of the first all-black regiments to serve in the United States Army during the Civil War. But the prologue for the film is the experiences of Robert Gould Shaw at the Battle of Antietam. And now we're going to take a look at portions of that.
And this is fairly accurate in depicting the way the 12th Corps is marching to the front. They were in what was called double column of companies, almost every regiment. And that meant you deployed an entire company in a line of battle, and then you put another company right beside it, and you stacked up all the other companies right behind them. So it looked like a big Greek phalanx. It was a really good formation for command and control. It was a very bad formation if you were exposed to artillery fire. So it was actually controversial within the Corps because the senior division commander, Alpheus Williams, begged the Corps commander, Joseph Mansfield, to allow him to deploy the men because he was afraid of the casualties they were going to take. And it turned out, Mansfield got shot very early in the fighting, and then Williams ordered everybody to deploy. But scenes like this, they play really well in the film, and showing him in his tent, writing a letter. The reality was the night before the battle, Robert Gould Shaw was sleeping in probably a plowed field on the George Line or the Sarah Hoffman farm. Very uncomfortable. They got into position after midnight. They maybe got about 3 hours sleep at the most. So there's no tents, anything like that. You would eat maybe some hardtack, maybe coffee in the morning. That would be it. That was your breakfast. The battle was already on by the time they're marching up towards the field. And again, these are all scenes that play really well for a film. You're seeing all these troops moving around and deploying and so on. In the real battle, you had to be very careful where you displayed your troops because of the artillery fire. So when troops revealed themselves and got out into the open, you had to move quickly. You couldn't move slowly or you would get chewed to pieces. So you don't have a lot of things like, there are instances where units are advancing like this in the battle and across the field with the flags flying and everything like that, and the Confederates are behind a fence. But actually in the case of the 2nd Massachusetts, which Shaw was they were engaged twice on September the 17th. And the first time they were engaged, the nature of their position, they were actually in a giant garden and orchard of the farm of David Miller, which is near the famous cornfield on the battlefield. And because of the nature of their position, they actually didn't take very many casualties, and they inflicted a lot upon the Confederates. So the Confederates weren't down and like behind the fence firing at this and firing their artillery at the second. There was a lot of artillery fire that was going on at this time, and there were horrific scenes like, people losing their head, and but you get the impression that the 2nd Massachusetts in this scene is just
annihilated,
utterly annihilated. Glory did a really good job trying to display the chaos, the violence of these Civil War battles. Even still, the landscape, when you look at it, doesn't look anything like the landscape that the men fought on. There's no orchards, there's no gardens, there's no farm buildings, there's no cornfields, there's a fence that the Confederates are behind. You see the Confederates in a very dense line there. Shaw is wounded. As far as I remember, he wasn't wounded by artillery fire, he was wounded by small arms fire. And what had happened was a Union infantry division under General John Sedgwick had advanced into the West Woods, a key terrain feature on the Antietam battlefield. And they didn't realize back in the East Woods that Sedgwick's entire division had been routed from the woods, because Sedgwick's division retreated north out of sight of 12th Corps officers who were in the East Woods. They received a request to reinforce Sedgwick, so they ordered the only 2 regiments they had available immediately, and that was the 2nd Massachusetts and the 13th New Jersey, which was a completely green regiment. I mean, the men literally hardly knew how to form a line of battle. And the 2nd was an extremely well-drilled regiment. It was considered to be the equivalent of the United States Regulars. And its commander, George Andrews, was a West Point graduate. He was a really well-known officer. He'd instilled like West Point regular Army discipline in the 2nd Mass. So they advanced up to the Hagerstown Pike. And when they got to the Pike, they came under fire from the West Woods. They couldn't see the Confederates. So again, one of the things we see in the film is like, you can see everybody, right? Everybody's very visible. So again, this is what the real battle is like. The Confederates don't expose themselves. They're in the woods, they're firing at you. There's a lot of confusion because if you're in the 2nd Massachusetts or the 13th New Jersey, those are supposed to be our friends in the woods. Those are our guys. What are they shooting at us for, right?
Number 3, Gauze and Generals from 2003. This is a very long, some people would say tedious, Civil War movie that we have examined in 3 parts here on Real History. But we did not examine its depiction of the Battle of Antietam, which is depicted in the director's cut. And that is what we are going to take a look at right now. We're starting off with an artillery duel here.
Yeah.
And they have the date wrong, September 19th, 1862. That's the most glaring error, I would say. Oh, that's really an unforgivable one. That's
pretty
really bad.
I guess that's General Lee there.
With Pendleton. So does Lee encounter his son during the Battle of Antietam?
He did, yeah, he did. It wasn't in a situation like this, but he did encounter his son, yeah.
Say what you will about the movie, but Lee really looks the part. And Duvall really looks like him.
He did.
Good casting. Wish he
Yeah.
had a better script to work with, though.
Yes, yeah.
So here we have the Miller cornfield.
We do have a cornfield, which is good. We have the 2 sides advancing towards each other, which actually never happened. You see here again, the troops are standing out in the open, shoulder arms. You couldn't do that at Antietam. I mean, you'd have been mauled by artillery fire. You could not do that. You notice how there's no fences, there's no plowed fields, there's no orchards, there's you don't have. They're trying to do the best they can, but you don't have a 19th century landscape. Now, some elements of this are true, in that this is trying to depict Hood's counterattack at Antietam. Hood's men did really do a lot of damage to the Federal troops that they encountered first, but the Federal troops that they encountered were in really bad condition, very disorganized. They'd been fighting for almost an hour at that point.
So here we have 20th Maine in reserve.
Yeah, the 20th Maine played no part in the Battle of Antietam. They were in reserve the entire time. They were on the east side of Antietam Creek. There wouldn't have been any artillery fire on them. You get the impression that they're kind of a part of the battle. The only real combat the 20th Maine saw in the Maryland campaign was a little bit at the Battle of Shepherdstown
yeah.
on the 20th. This is again depicting a moment where this is General Hood on the White Horse, and this is Sandy Pendleton from Jackson asking Hood, you know, how things are going, and just, it's kind of comical. Like, reinforcements, yes, okay, all right. You know, you see these lines are standing and firing at each other. I'm not saying sometimes this stuff didn't happen. It did not happen in this particular instance here. These men are, I think, probably meant to depict the 1st Texas. The 1st Texas charged through the cornfield, like you see here, and the Federal soldiers were...
There's the Texas flag.
Yeah, the Federal soldiers were actually on the northern end of the cornfield. It was the Pennsylvania Reserves, and they were lying down behind the fence there. The Texans never saw them.
Yeah.
So when the first thing the Pennsylvanians saw was soldiers from Doubleday's division coming through the corn, and they were telling them as they're coming through the corn, they're like, the Rebs are right behind us.
Right.
And ultimately, Hood's division, the whole division, took 50% casualties, which is just catastrophic.
It is.
For a unit. And they were a really good fighting unit, but they came up against a tough commander in Joe Hooker. So they had 3 commanders that were integral in the defeat of Hood's division. Another thing you often see, and I mean this is something that Hollywood kind of has to do, is that artillery is exploding when it hits the ground. That would be a percussion shell, which had the fuse on a rifled shell on the nose of the shell. Most of the shells that are being fired at Antietam are shell or shrapnel, and they're going to burst in the air. The idea that Stonewall Jackson would be sitting out there where all these cannons are destroyed, and so there was no cannons destroyed like that. There were a few cannons that got dismounted. Usually the crews got wiped out.
Number 4, 1883. 1883, of course, is the successful spin-off Western of Paramount's Kevin Costner series, Yellowstone. And I think it's worthy of a quick examination here as we start to wrap up our conversation, because a flashback within the series takes Tim McGraw's character back to the Battle of Antietam, and there's a nice little cameo in this segment as well. So let's go ahead and take a look. So at the outset here, we see a recreation of the famous photo of the Dunker Church. Why do you think this is such an enduring photograph from the Battle of Antietam?
Well, the church was a central landmark on the battlefield. Literally everybody who writes about the battle, who was there, saw the church, because it was such a landmark that stood out on the battlefield. And it had the misfortune of being on a plateau of ground that extends across the road, across the Hagerstown Pike, where today the Park Visitor Center is. I call it the Dunker Church Plateau. That was Hooker's objective when the Union First Corps opened its attack. He saw that as the key terrain he needed to capture. There was terrain that was probably more valuable than that, but it was an important position. It would be the scene of terrific fighting during the morning in particular. The Confederates launched 2 counterattacks against Federal forces that were deployed on the ridge right behind where the Park Visitor Center is today, and they attacked across the Dunker Church Plateau. There was a Federal artillery battery there. There was a small infantry division. They just mowed the Confederates down in both of these attacks. So the soldiers that you see in the photograph are Confederate infantrymen. They're either from Kershaw's South Carolina Brigade, or they were from Manning's North Carolina, Virginia Brigade. And in fact, I think he even had an Arkansas regiment in that brigade. But those Confederate units took very heavy casualties. And the soldiers that you see laying there on the ground, the dead soldiers, they're Confederate soldiers, infantrymen, they're not artillerymen. You see the wreckage of part of an artillery battery. That was from S.D. Lee's battalion, which had been posted there in the morning of September 17th. And they'd lost so many horses on some of the batteries, they had to abandon the limber that you see there. Sometimes you'll see in captions, you'll say, well, all these Confederate artillerymen are dead. They're not artillerymen, they're infantrymen. You can see the way they're laying. They probably were hit by a blast of canister from the artillery battery, because there's a lot of them in that one group. And then the church just is this iconic feature in the background. It's kind of like, this is the war, this is the war that's presented to the American public after the Battle of Antietam, when these images are displayed in New York City.
Yeah, and it remains grim and iconic to this very day.
Yeah.
Tom Hanks is George Meade coming onto the scene here. You're stumbling through all the debris.
So we're presuming that this is September 18th, when the two armies are on the field. There is no official truce that's called. There is a temporary truce in some parts of the line. This never happened. Meade never met with any Confederate officer that he knew. I think the one thing they're trying to do with the Tim McGraw character is that, it's a Confederate soldier who's been in a really hard part of the fight. He's emotionally distraught. This happened. We know that there's numerous soldiers who suffered trauma from this battle. Some soldiers writing about, I can never efface it from my memory ever again. Soldiers writing about, I've been sick for the last few days. I couldn't even get up off the ground. I've had this terrible headache. The commander of the 7th Maine, which was ordered to make a suicidal charge late in the battle, he writes in his memoir, he said that he and a lot of the men just broke down in tears afterwards when they got back, because they'd lost so many comrades in a fruitless assault. But Meade had a lot of work to do. On the 18th, he didn't have time to come out and sit on a broken limber here and converse with a former Confederate soldier. Now, the thing is that is not necessarily inaccurate, is that a soldier like Meade, who had been in the regular army, he knew a lot of guys in the Confederate Army who'd been in the regular army.
That's a great point.
And we today, when we look back on the Civil War, we're like, oh, you could have nothing to do with the soldiers on the other side. You hated them. You hated those soldiers. Well, Meade didn't necessarily hate these guys. He's fighting a war against them, but some of these men he'd served with, they'd fought in the Mexican War together. They'd been at army posts, or maybe they'd done on engineering jobs with him. He knew them. Maybe he'd had fun with them. They'd laughed with them. They told some jokes. They were people. Yeah. They were human beings. And if you were George Meade, it's conceivable that if something like this came up, you could actually... Meade does have a conversation at the end of the war with Robert E. Lee. Because when Lee sees Meade, Meade at that point is the commander of the Army of the Potomac, when Lee sees Meade, he says to Meade, he goes, "General, where did all those gray hairs in your head come from?" And Meade said, "You're responsible for most of them."
I've never heard of that one before. So that's great.
So, I mean, the thing is, those sorts of things could happen on a battlefield like Antietam. But sometimes we get the impression that these weren't real armies. These guys were kind of like very casual about everything. This was the real deal. These were real armies. Even in places where the truce was in force, if you stepped beyond the picket line, the other skirmish line could shoot you. And in certain places they did. Like down at the Sunken Lane area was incredibly deadly. Like if you exposed yourself and you were in a place you weren't supposed to, the sharpshooters killed you or wounded you. In the northern end of the field, kind of near where the Dunker Church was, I found instances where they shot at you, but not to kill you or wound you. They shot to warn you, get back where you're supposed to be. Wow. So it just kind of like at the very southern end of the battlefield, there were some Confederate soldiers who were trying to assist wounded Union soldiers who were like begging for help out in front of their lines, and one of the Confederate soldiers got killed by a Union sharpshooter. And this Confederate soldier was writing about it. He says that ended, our benevolence. We're not doing any more of that. So, but that sort of stuff happened on both sides. It wasn't the sort of thing where everybody's sitting down going, well, you know, we fought a good fight, and it was a tough one, but, you know, it's good to see you again. That didn't happen. Now, after the battle is over and the armies have retreated, there are several accounts that I came across of Confederate soldiers, officers who are wounded, and they had to be left behind because they were too seriously wounded. And they write wonderful things about the way they were treated by, like this one guy was, I forget who he was, he might have been a colonel, and he's in a private house with another wounded Union officer. And he said the wounded Union officer was getting these boxes from home, and everything that came, he shared with a Confederate. You know, and he was like, hey, these guys are really nice to me. They took really good care of me. There's a Confederate officer in James Walker's division who was writing right after the battle. He says, and this is an amazing admission, that our wounded probably stand a better chance of recovery if they get taken by the Union than if they get into a Confederate field hospital. So those sorts of things in field hospitals, like there's another story of a wounded Union soldier who was at a hospital, I think it might have been the Smoketown Hospital in the northern end of the battlefield, and a wounded North Carolinian who was ambulatory would go out and get him food. That's how he got his food and water, was this North Carolinian. He'd just kind of wander around and get this stuff for him. And, you know, he was so appreciative, and they became friends, he and this Confederate. So they're human beings. This sort of stuff happened.
Yeah.
And when the bullets stopped flying, people could kind of, like, be human to one another. And they were. I mean, there are instances of burial details during the truce where, you know, some of these enlisted men are out there like, what are we doing this for? You know, why are we slaughtering each other out here? I mean, you know, sometimes enlisted men don't really understand all the ramifications of what's going on, but they also see the insanity of all of this. And they're like, what are we doing?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I could be friends with you. I don't want to be your enemy. I don't want to kill you. But, you know, half hour later, the truce is over. They're shooting at each other again.
Yeah. So I think there's some despite some of the bad uniforms that we see here, I think there's some kernels of truth in it for as short a scene as it is, because it certainly speaks to the trauma and the shared experience that these men are going through. And I think it's safe to say that for the characters depicted, they too would have dreaded the thought of the place.
They would have.
Inside.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
So there you have it, some insights by historian Scott Hartwig on how the Battle of Antietam has been depicted in film. Scott, give us one more quick rundown on your book and where people can find it.
Any good bookstore, of course, Amazon, Barnes & Noble are going to have it. But of course, I always advocate people supporting their local bookstores if you can. You can get it directly from Johns Hopkins, as a matter of fact, as well. My purpose was not to tell every single detail of the battle, to make it a tedious sort of thing like a official history of Antietam. I wanted to tell the story of the people who lived the battle. So it's the story of General McClellan, General Lee, but privates and corporals and wives at home and people who worked in the hospitals and civilians who suffered as a result of the battle. And I wanted to tell in this book the whole story of Antietam, not just the military story, the entire story of what Antietam was. To give, and also another purpose of this book was to give people a feeling for what a Civil War battle was like. So I do get into some places where I talk about tactics, because tactics are how you lived and died on a battlefield. And sometimes people think tactics are dry, but for a soldier in a battle like Antietam, proficiency in tactics is going to keep you alive and maybe do damage to the enemy. So it's a story. That's what I want it to be. I want it to be a story. I don't want it to be official history. I want it to be something that's interesting to somebody who knows a lot about Antietam and knows nothing about it.
Very good. Well, I look forward to getting my copy and reading it. And for all you history buffs out there, you should feel exactly the same way. Once again, the title of the book, I Dread the Thought of the Place. So, Scott, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Real History.
Thanks for having me, Jerry.
All right, great to see you again.
Same here.
All right,
Yeah.
until we see you next time, stay curious.